It was a bright Monday morning when Dr. Marcus Reed, one of the youngest and most brilliant surgeons in the state, arrived at the prestigious Pinecrest General Hospital. Clad in his scrubs and carrying his usual confident demeanor, Marcus was ready for another demanding day in the operating room. But little did he know, this day would challenge not just his skills as a surgeon, but his very essence as a human being. Marcus had always been a trailblazer. As one of the few black surgeons at Pinecrest, he had built a reputation for being calm under pressure, meticulous in his work, and above all, compassionate toward his patients. Yet, despite his undeniable expertise, he was no stranger to the whispers in the hallways, the occasional condescending remarks, and the subtle yet ever-present tension from some of his colleagues. But Marcus never let it deter him. He was here to save lives, not win a popularity contest. That morning, as he made his way to the locker room, he passed a group of senior doctors standing in the corridor, their voices hushed but their body language animated. Among them was Dr. Charles Hanover, the head of surgery, a man whose stern face and piercing blue eyes made him a figure both respected and feared. Next to him stood Dr. Walter Grayson, the hospital's chief anesthesiologist, known for his old-school mentality and sharp tongue. The air seemed heavier than usual, and Marcus caught snippets of their conversation, something about an urgent situation involving a high-profile patient. He didn't pay much attention at first. After all, Pinecrest often dealt with high-stakes cases. As he entered the operating room to prepare for his scheduled procedure, Marcus was greeted by Dr. Evelyn Carter, one of the few colleagues he genuinely trusted. Evelyn, a skilled pediatric surgeon, had been a close friend since their residency days. Her warm smile briefly eased the unease brewing in his gut. "You heard about the governor?" she asked, her voice low. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Governor? No. What's going on?" Evelyn glanced around, ensuring no one else was listening. "Governor Harris was rushed in early this morning. Some kind of cardiac issue. Hanover and his crew are scrambling to figure it out." Marcus nodded slowly, processing the information. Governor Harris was a polarizing figure, known for his fiery speeches and controversial policies. Despite his divisive reputation, he was still the governor, and his health would undoubtedly become a matter of public interest. Just as Marcus was about to reply, the doors swung open, and in walked Dr. Hanover, his face etched with a mix of urgency and irritation. He barely glanced at Marcus before addressing Evelyn. "Dr. Carter, you're needed in OR2. Now." His tone left no room for questions. Evelyn shot Marcus an apologetic look before hurrying out. As she disappeared through the doors, Dr. Grayson entered, his expression just as grim. The two men exchanged a brief, silent glance before Dr. Hanover turned to Marcus. "Reed," he said curtly, "we won't be needing you for this one." Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Hanover replied, his voice icy. "Your services won't be required for this case. Focus on your scheduled patients." For a moment, Marcus stood there, stunned. He wasn't scheduled to assist in the governor's case, but the pointed tone and dismissive attitude made it clear that this wasn't just about logistics. He opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself. Years of navigating similar slights had taught him to pick his battles wisely. Without another word, he turned back to his preparations, though the knot in his stomach tightened. The hours ticked by, and the tension in the hospital was palpable. Whispers spread like wildfire among the staff. Rumors of complications in the governor's surgery began to circulate. Marcus tried to focus on his own patients, but the unease lingered. Something about the way Hanover and Grayson had acted earlier gnawed at him. Finally, as Marcus was finishing his last procedure of the day, Evelyn burst into the room, her face pale and her breathing ragged. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling, "they need you in OR1. Now." He frowned, wiping his hands clean. "I thought I wasn't needed." "Things have changed," Evelyn replied, her tone urgent. "The governor's condition is deteriorating, and they can't stabilize him. Hanover's asking for you." Marcus stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "Hanover's asking for me," he repeated, incredulous. Evelyn nodded, her eyes pleading. "Marcus, they're desperate." For a brief moment, he felt a surge of vindication. The same people who had dismissed him earlier were now calling on him in their moment of crisis. But that feeling was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. This wasn't about ego or proving a point. A life was on the line, and he had a duty to uphold. Without another word, Marcus strode out of the room, his mind racing. As he approached all one, the sight before him stopped him in his tracks. Hanover, Grayson, and a handful of other doctors stood outside, their faces a mix of panic and exhaustion. The sight of Marcus seemed to bring an unspoken wave of relief, though none of them said it out loud. Hanover stepped forward, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Reed, we need you in there. Now." Marcus met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "You didn't need me before," he said evenly. Hanover hesitated, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "I was wrong," he admitted, though the words seemed to burn on his tongue. "Please, we don't have time for this." Marcus nodded, his focus shifting to the task at hand. "What's the situation?" As they briefed him on the complications, Marcus donned his gloves and surgical gown, mentally preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most high-pressure surgery of his career. But as he stepped into the OR and saw the governor lying on the table, pale and motionless, a chilling thought crossed his mind. If they had called him in earlier, would things have already been different? The monitors beeped erratically, the room buzzing with urgency. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't just a fight to save a life. It was a battle against prejudice, against doubt, and against time itself. And as the doors swung shut behind him, leaving the chaos of the hospital corridor behind, Marcus knew one thing for certain: he would give everything he had to turn this around, no matter what it took. Inside the operating room, the air was thick with tension. The overhead lights cast a sterile glow on Governor Harris, who lay unconscious on the table, his life hanging by a thread. The medical team worked in near silence, their movements deliberate but weighed down by the mounting pressure. Dr. Marcus Reed stepped forward, his hands steady, his mind focused. For years, he had trained for moments like this, where precision and composure were everything. But this time, it wasn't just about saving a patient. It was about proving to the people around him, and perhaps even to himself, that he belonged here. As Marcus began assessing the situation, his eyes darted to the monitors. The governor's vitals were unstable, his heart struggling to maintain a rhythm. The earlier surgical attempts had left behind a trail of missteps. A poorly placed stitch, unnecessary trauma to the surrounding tissue, and what looked like an overlooked arterial tear. Marcus felt a surge of frustration but buried it. There was no time for blame, not when every second counted. "Dr. Reed, what do you need?" asked one of the nurses, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "A suction tube and a fresh clamp set," Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying a calm authority. He glanced at the attending anesthesiologist, a younger doctor who looked like he was on the verge of panic. "We need to stabilize his blood pressure now. Increase the dopamine drip to 10 micrograms per kilogram per minute and monitor his oxygen levels closely." The team moved quickly, following his orders without hesitation. Marcus could feel the eyes of the other surgeons on him, particularly Dr. Hanover, who stood near the back of the room. His presence was palpable, a mix of lingering skepticism and reluctant hope. Marcus chose to ignore him. Right now, all that mattered was the man on the table. As he worked, Marcus's thoughts briefly drifted back to his childhood. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, he had learned early on the importance of resilience. His mother, a nurse, had inspired his love for medicine, while his father, a high school teacher, had taught him the value of integrity. Marcus had faced challenges at every stage of his journey, from being the only black student in his medical school cohort to enduring the subtle, insidious biases that came with working in a predominantly white institution. But each obstacle had only sharpened his resolve. He had spent his entire career fighting to be seen for his skills, not the color of his skin. The memory faded as Marcus focused on the task before him. "There's a tear in the left coronary artery," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "I need a 6-0 suture and vascular forceps." The nurse handed him the tools, and Marcus began the painstaking work of repairing the tear. The room was so quiet that the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor seemed deafening. Each movement of his hands was deliberate, calculated, the culmination of years of training and experience. The tension in the room was almost tangible, but Marcus felt a familiar sense of clarity settle over him. This was where he thrived, in the eye of the storm. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the governor's condition began to stabilize. The bleeding had been controlled, and his heart rhythm was returning to normal. Marcus could feel the collective relief of the team, though no one dared to express it just yet. There was still work to be done. "Dr. Reed," came Hanover's voice from behind him, breaking the silence. "What's the next step?" Marcus didn't look up. "We'll need to place a temporary pacemaker to ensure stability during recovery. Once that's done, we can close him up and move him to the ICU." Hanover nodded, his usually authoritative demeanor noticeably subdued. For the first time, Marcus sensed something almost like respect in the older man's tone. But he didn't dwell on it. Respect, if it came at all, would have to be earned over time, not in a single surgery. As the procedure continued, Marcus found himself reflecting on the events that had led up to this moment. Why had Hanover and the others been so quick to dismiss him earlier? Was it pure prejudice, or was there something deeper at play? He recalled the whispers he had overheard that morning, the sense of unease that had lingered in the air. Something about this entire situation felt off, as though there were pieces of the puzzle he was still missing. When the pacemaker was successfully placed, Marcus stepped back, his gloves stained with blood, but his expression calm. "Let's close him up," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The team moved swiftly to follow his lead, the tension in the room beginning to dissipate. By the time the procedure was complete, Governor Harris' vitals were stable, and he was ready to be transferred to the ICU. The relief in the room was palpable, though it was clear that no one wanted to celebrate too soon. Marcus removed his gloves and surgical mask, his face betraying none of the exhaustion he felt. He looked over at Hanover, who was standing near the door, his arms crossed. "It's done," Marcus said simply. Hanover nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good work, Dr. Reed." It was the closest thing to an apology Marcus would ever get, and he knew it. But before he could respond, the doors to the OR swung open, and a hospital administrator stepped in, her face pale and drawn. "Dr. Hanover," she said, her voice urgent. "We need to speak. Now." Hanover glanced at Marcus before following the administrator out of the room. Marcus watched them go, his earlier unease returning. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut. As the surgical team began cleaning up, Marcus made his way to the locker room, the adrenaline finally beginning to wear off. He sat down on a bench, his head in his hands. The surgery had been a success, but the day was far from over. Questions swirled in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Why had they waited so long to call him in? What weren't they telling him about the governor's condition? And most importantly, what would happen next? Before he could dwell on it further, Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her face etched with concern. "Marcus," she said softly, "you should come to the conference room. There's something you need to see." Marcus looked up, his exhaustion replaced by a growing sense of dread. He followed Evelyn down the hallway, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the walls. As they approached the conference room, he could hear raised voices inside. He hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, a group of senior staff members was gathered around a table, their expressions a mix of anger and fear. On the screen at the front of the room was a news broadcast, the headline scrolling across the bottom in bold letters. "Governor Harris in critical condition amid surgery scandal." Marcus's heart sank as the realization hit him. This wasn't just about saving the governor's life. It was about saving the hospital's reputation, and by extension their own careers, and somehow he had been thrust into the middle of it all. As the room fell silent, all eyes turned to Marcus. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he had stepped into a moment of triumph or a brewing storm that would change everything. The conference room buzzed with an uneasy energy as the hospital's leadership exchanged tense glances, their hushed conversations growing sharper. Marcus stood near the door, his pulse quickening as he tried to piece together what was unfolding. Evelyn nudged him forward gently, her expression unreadable. All eyes turned to Dr. Hanover, who stood at the head of the table, his typically commanding presence diminished under the weight of the moment. The media got wind of the governor's condition. Hanover began, his voice unusually low. "They're speculating about errors during the initial surgery." His gaze flickered briefly toward Marcus before shifting to the others. "We need to get ahead of this." Marcus's jaw tightened. He could feel the unspoken tension in the room, the way some of his colleagues avoided his eyes. He had seen this play out before, the subtle shifting of blame, the quiet effort to shield those in power at the expense of someone else. He wasn't naive enough to think he was immune. One of the administrators, a wiry man in a grey suit, cleared his throat. "What exactly happened during the first attempt?" he asked, his voice sharp. "From what I've been told, there were multiple complications, missteps." Hanover's expression darkened. "We had to make quick decisions. The situation was critical." "That doesn't explain why Dr. Reed wasn't brought in sooner," Evelyn interjected, her tone pointed. "He clearly turned the situation around. Why wasn't he part of the initial team?" The room fell silent, the question hanging in the air like a loaded gun. Marcus looked at Evelyn, grateful for her support, but also wary of where this conversation might lead. Hanover's lips thinned. "We followed protocol," he said curtly. "The decision was made based on the team we had available at the time." Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Protocol or not, you knew I was in the building. If I'd been called earlier, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation." Hanover's face flushed, but he didn't respond. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the faint hum of the projector displaying the news broadcast. Marcus's words had struck a nerve, and everyone in the room knew it. Evelyn crossed her arms, her eyes locked on Hanover. "Marcus saved the governor's life today. That's the story we should be focusing on." The administrator in the grey suit interjected, his tone cautious. "That may be true, but the narrative has already shifted. The public is going to ask why the governor's condition deteriorated in the first place. We need to present a united front." Marcus bristled at the implication. "A united front or a cover-up?" he asked, his voice cutting through the room. "Because if this is about protecting reputations instead of being honest about what happened, I'm not interested." The tension in the room deepened, and for a moment, no one spoke. Marcus could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air, but he refused to back down. He had spent too many years staying quiet, enduring slights and injustices for the sake of keeping the peace. Not this time. Before anyone could respond, the door swung open, and a nurse stepped in, her face pale. "Dr. Reed, Dr. Hanover," she said quickly, "you're needed in the ICU. The governor's condition is worsening." The room erupted into motion as Marcus and Hanover hurried out, leaving the others behind to continue their whispered deliberations. Evelyn caught Marcus's arm as they walked. "Be careful," she said softly. "They're looking for someone to blame." Marcus nodded, his mind racing as they reached the ICU. The sight of Governor Harris on the hospital bed, surrounded by beeping monitors and a flurry of medical staff, sent a jolt of urgency through him. His skin was ashen, his chest rising and falling unevenly. The temporary pacemaker was struggling to keep up, and his blood pressure had plummeted. "What's his status?" Marcus asked, moving quickly to assess the situation. The attending physician, a young woman with wide eyes, rattled off the details. "His heart rate's erratic, and his oxygen levels are dropping. We suspect a secondary complication, possibly a clot or infection." Marcus's mind raced as he reviewed the data. The surgery had gone well, but complications weren't uncommon in cases like this. He exchanged a quick glance with Hanover, who looked more frazzled than ever. "We need to stabilize him immediately," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Prep him for imaging. If there's a clot, we need to locate it before it causes further damage." The team moved with precision, their earlier doubts about Marcus seemingly forgotten in the face of the crisis. As he worked, Marcus felt a familiar clarity settle over him. This was where he excelled, navigating chaos, making decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. But even as he focused on the governor, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. Was this complication truly an unfortunate turn of events, or was there something more to it? Hours later, as the governor was stabilized once more, Marcus finally allowed himself to step back. His muscles ached, and his mind was a whirlwind of exhaustion and unanswered questions. Hanover approached him, his face lined with stress. For a moment, neither man spoke. "You did good work today," Hanover said finally, his tone begrudging. Marcus met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Good enough to call me in earlier next time." Hanover's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone in the hallway. As the adrenaline began to fade, Marcus's thoughts turned to the larger picture. The tension in the awe, the whispers in the conference room, the media frenzy, it all pointed to something deeper. Something that went beyond the operating table. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he was determined to find them. Evelyn found him a short while later, her face a mix of relief and worry. "How's the governor?" "Stable for now," Marcus replied, "but there's still a lot we don't know." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "There's something strange about all of this, Marcus. The way they handled the case, the way they're scrambling now, it doesn't add up." "I know," he said quietly. "But until we figure out what's really going on, we have to be careful. They're already looking for a scapegoat." Evelyn's eyes softened. "You've got me in your corner," she said firmly. "Don't forget that." Marcus gave her a small, grateful smile, but his mind was already racing ahead. The day's events had left him with more questions than answers, and he knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. But one thing was clear: he wasn't just fighting for his reputation. He was fighting for the truth, and he wouldn't stop until he found it. The hours ticked by as Marcus and Evelyn sifted through the fragmented pieces of the puzzle. The small office was dimly lit, papers and digital files spread across the desk like a battlefield. Each document seemed to carry another layer of intrigue, but the connections were maddeningly elusive. Marcus rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't just dealing with surgical missteps or bureaucratic cover-ups anymore. This was a full-scale conspiracy, one that could ruin lives or worse. Evelyn leaned forward, scrolling through a report on her laptop. "Look at this," she said, her voice urgent. "The governor's pre-op blood work. There's a note about a potential allergy to a specific anesthetic, but it wasn't flagged during the procedure." Marcus frowned, scanning the screen. If they knew about this, why wasn't it brought up in the OR? That could have contributed to the complications. "Exactly," Evelyn said, her voice lowering. "But here's the thing. This version of the report is dated after the surgery. It's been altered. Someone wanted it to look like the team overlooked a critical warning." Marcus's chest tightened as the implications sank in. Whoever was behind, this wasn't just manipulating events in real time. They were actively rewriting history to shift the blame onto the medical staff. Onto him. Before he could respond, Marcus's phone buzzed on the desk. The number was unlisted, but something about the timing made him answer. "Dr. Reed," he said cautiously. "Dr. Reed," a deep, composed voice replied. "You don't know me, but I know you, and I know what you've been digging into tonight." Marcus felt Evelyn's eyes on him as the voice continued. "Let me make something clear. You're in way over your head. Walk away now, and this will all blow over. Keep pushing, and you'll regret it." The line went dead before Marcus could respond. He stared at the phone, the words echoing in his mind. Someone knew exactly what they were doing, and they were watching him. Evelyn's face was pale. What did they say? Just another warning, Marcus said, his voice tight. But it only confirms we're on the right track. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but a sudden knock at the door made them both jump. Marcus stood, his pulse racing as he opened the door to reveal a security guard. The man looked uneasy, shifting his weight as he spoke. "Dr. Reed, there's an issue in the ICU. The governor's condition just took a turn for the worse." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He grabbed his coat and followed the guard, Evelyn close behind. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the fluorescent lights casting an eerie glow. By the time they reached the ICU, the tension in the air was palpable. Monitors blared as a team of nurses worked frantically to stabilize the governor. His face was ashen, his breathing shallow. "What happened?" Marcus demanded, moving to assess the situation. The attending physician looked up, his face drawn. "Sudden cardiac arrest. We're trying to get him back, but it's not looking good." Marcus's mind raced as he took in the scene. The governor's vitals had been stable just hours ago. For his condition to deteriorate this quickly, something had to have triggered it. He glanced at the IV line, his eyes narrowing. "Check the infusion bag," he said sharply. "I want to know exactly what he's being given." A nurse quickly complied, her hands trembling as she read off the label. Marcus's stomach dropped as he recognized the name of the drug. It was a powerful anticoagulant, one that shouldn't have been administered in his current state. "Who ordered this?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising. The nurses exchanged uncertain glances, but no one spoke up. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Someone needs to answer. This isn't a mistake, it's deliberate." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Marcus's mind churned as he pieced it together. The altered reports, the mysterious phone call, and now this. Someone was actively trying to ensure the governor wouldn't survive the night, and they were willing to sabotage his care to make it happen. As the team worked to stabilize the governor, Marcus pulled Evelyn aside. "This is bigger than we thought," he said quietly. "If they're willing to go this far, we're running out of time." Evelyn nodded, her expression grim. "We need proof, something concrete to expose them." Marcus's thoughts raced as he considered their options. The hospital's surveillance system. If they could access the footage, they might be able to see who tampered with the medication. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. They slipped out of the ICU, careful not to draw attention. The security office was on the other side of the hospital, and the journey felt like an eternity. When they finally arrived, Marcus hesitated. Breaking into the system would cross a line, but he knew they didn't have a choice. Evelyn took the lead, her tech-savvy skills proving invaluable as she bypassed the login screen. Minutes later, they were scrolling through the footage, their hearts pounding with every frame. "There," Marcus said, pointing at the screen. A figure in scrubs was seen entering the ICU just before the governor's condition worsened. The angle obscured their face, but their movements were deliberate. Evelyn enhanced the image, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "I'll cross-reference this with the staff schedule," she said. "Whoever this is, they're not a nurse." Marcus's stomach churned as the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a cover-up, it was a calculated attack. And the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the danger wasn't just to the governor. The sound of footsteps in the hallway jolted them both. Marcus quickly shut down the computer, his pulse racing as the door creaked open. A shadow loomed in the doorway, and Marcus braced himself for what was to come. Marcus's heart thudded in his chest as the door creaked open wider, the shadow in the doorway growing larger. For a moment, the dim glow of the computer screen was the only light in the room, casting an eerie glow on the tense scene. A tall figure stepped into the room, and Marcus instinctively moved in front of Evelyn, ready to defend himself. But as the figure emerged from the shadows, Marcus felt a mix of shock and anger. It was Dr. Caldwell, the chief of surgery. His usual composed demeanor was gone, replaced with something colder, more calculating. He glanced at the computer, then back at Marcus and Evelyn, his lips curling into a tight smile. "I had a feeling you'd be here," Caldwell said, his voice calm but laced with menace. Marcus straightened, his fists clenched. "You knew about this. You've been part of it from the beginning, haven't you?" Caldwell took a step closer, his hands clasped behind his back. "Careful with your accusations, Dr. Reed. You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Evelyn, undeterred, stepped forward, holding her ground. "We know enough. We saw the footage. We know someone tampered with the governor's medication, and we know it wasn't an accident." Caldwell's expression hardened. "You think you're heroes, don't you? Exposing the big conspiracy, saving the day. But this isn't a movie. The world doesn't work that way." Marcus felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "So it's true. You tried to kill the governor. Why? Money? Power?" Caldwell laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You're so naive. Do you have any idea how much pressure the governor has put on this hospital? Cutting budgets, slashing programs, threatening our very existence. He's a liability, not just to us, but to the entire healthcare system." Marcus shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "So you think that justifies murder?" Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "Sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good. You're a surgeon, Dr. Reed. You should understand that." Before Marcus could respond, Evelyn interrupted. "And what about Marcus? You planned to frame him, didn't you? Let him take the fall for your crimes." Caldwell smirked. Marcus was convenient, a talented surgeon with a controversial reputation. Who would question it if things went wrong under his watch? The weight of Caldwell's words settled over Marcus like a dark cloud. He had spent his entire career fighting to prove himself, and now he was being used as a pawn in someone else's twisted game. But he wasn't about to back down. "Your plan isn't going to work," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We have evidence. We're taking this to the authorities." Caldwell's smile faded, replaced with a cold glare. "You think they'll believe you? A disgraced surgeon and his idealistic protégé. Good luck with that." As Caldwell turned to leave, Evelyn spoke up, her voice sharp. "Actually, they might believe this." She held up her phone, the screen glowing with the security footage they had just uncovered. She had recorded everything: the altered files, the tampered medication, and now Caldwell's own admission. Caldwell froze, his face pale. For the first time, he looked genuinely rattled. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "If you release that, you'll destroy more than just me. The hospital, the staff, everything we've built, it'll all come crashing down." Marcus stepped forward, his voice resolute. "Then maybe it's time for a rebuild. One without people like you." Caldwell opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of approaching footsteps silenced him. Moments later, 2 security guards entered the room, followed by the hospital administrator. Caldwell's face twisted in fury as he realized what was happening. "You set me up," he hissed at Marcus and Evelyn. "No," Marcus said calmly. "You set yourself up. We just gave you the chance to tell the truth." As the guards escorted Caldwell away, Marcus felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The nightmare was finally over, but the fight had taken its toll. He turned to Evelyn, who gave him a small, tired smile. "We did it," she said softly. Marcus nodded, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed. It was the ICU. The governor had stabilized. The team had managed to reverse the damage caused by the tampered medication, and his condition was improving. For the first time in what felt like days, Marcus allowed himself to breathe. The governor was safe, Caldwell was exposed, and the truth was finally out. But just as he began to relax, a thought struck him, sending a chill down his spine. What if Caldwell wasn't the only one involved? What if there were others, higher up, who had orchestrated this from the shadows. The fight might not be over after all. As Marcus and Evelyn left the security office, the weight of that possibility hung over them, a reminder that the truth was rarely simple, and the battle for justice was far from finished. The morning light crept into the hospital corridors, casting a soft glow that felt almost out of place after the chaos of the night. Marcus sat in the break room with Evelyn, both of them nursing cups of lukewarm coffee. The adrenaline that had carried them through the night was fading, replaced by exhaustion and the quiet realization of what they had just accomplished. The ICU had finally stabilized, and the governor was out of immediate danger. The hospital administrator had taken charge of the investigation, promising a thorough review of the events that had unfolded. Caldwell, escorted off the premises in handcuffs, was facing criminal charges, and the evidence Marcus and Evelyn had collected was now in the hands of the authorities. It felt like a victory, but there was an underlying heaviness that neither of them could shake. Evelyn broke the silence, her voice low. "Do you think it's really over? Or are there more people involved that we haven't uncovered yet?" Marcus stared into his coffee, the steam curling upward like a question mark. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if there are, they'll think twice before trying something like this again. Caldwell's arrest sends a message. No one is untouchable." Evelyn nodded, but her eyes betrayed her lingering unease. It's just hard to believe that someone could justify risking so many lives for their own agenda, and to think they almost got away with it. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a reassuring squeeze. "Almost, but they didn't, because you didn't back down. If it weren't for you, Evelyn, I don't know if we'd have gotten this far." She smiled faintly, but the weight of the past few days lingered in her expression. "It wasn't just me. We made a good team, Marcus, even when everything was stacked against us." For a moment, there was a comfortable silence between them. The hospital around them was waking up, staff beginning their morning routines, patients stirring in their rooms. Life went on, even after a night like this. It was a reminder of why they did what they did, why they fought so hard, even when the odds seemed impossible. Later that day, Marcus stood outside the hospital, the crisp winter air biting at his skin. Reporters had gathered near the entrance, eager for any updates on the governor's condition and the unfolding scandal. Marcus had avoided the cameras so far, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the story broke. Evelyn joined him, her coat pulled tightly around her. "You think they'll paint us as heroes?" she asked, half joking. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "I think they'll paint us as troublemakers who wouldn't let things go. But that's fine by me. Sometimes causing trouble is the only way to make things right." Evelyn grinned. "I'll take that." They watched as the hospital administrator stepped out to address the press, carefully choosing words that revealed just enough without exposing too much. It was a delicate balance, protecting the hospital's reputation while ensuring transparency about the events that had unfolded. Marcus felt a twinge of frustration at the diplomacy of it all, but he reminded himself that the truth was out there now. The rest would follow in time. Over the next few weeks, the fallout from the scandal reverberated throughout the hospital and beyond. Caldwell's arrest made headlines, and the investigation uncovered a network of complicit individuals who had helped him orchestrate his scheme. Some were motivated by money, others by fear or loyalty, but in the end, they all faced justice. The governor, after a long recovery, publicly thanked the medical staff who had saved his life, specifically acknowledging Marcus and Evelyn for their courage in exposing the truth. For Marcus, the recognition was bittersweet. He had spent years trying to prove himself, battling against prejudice and doubt. This victory felt different. It wasn't just about his reputation. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it came at great personal risk. He realized that the respect he had been chasing all his life didn't matter as much as the values he chose to live by. Evelyn, too, found herself changed by the experience. She had always been passionate about medicine, but this ordeal had ignited something deeper, a determination to fight for fairness and accountability in the healthcare system. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she wasn't alone. Marcus had become more than a mentor to her. He was a partner in a shared mission. One quiet afternoon, Marcus found himself back in the OR, the steady rhythm of surgery providing a sense of normalcy he hadn't felt in weeks. His hands moved with practiced precision, his mind focused on the task at hand. It was a reminder of why he had become a surgeon in the first place: to heal, to save, to give people a second chance. After the procedure, he stepped into the hallway and saw Evelyn waiting for him. She held up a folder, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "You're not going to believe this," she said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Do I even want to know?" Evelyn grinned. "It's a proposal for a new mentorship program. For underrepresented medical students. They want us to co-lead it." Marcus blinked, surprised. "Us? After everything that's happened?" Evelyn nodded. "Exactly. They're calling it a fresh start, a way to rebuild trust and inspire the next generation. What do you think?" For a moment, Marcus said nothing, his mind racing through all the reasons to say no. But then he thought about everything they had been through, the lives they had touched, and the difference they could still make. He smiled. "I think it's time to cause some more trouble." Evelyn laughed, and together, they walked down the hallway, the weight of the past finally lifting. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain. They would face it together, with the same resolve that had carried them through the darkest of nights. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the hospital in a warm, golden glow, Marcus felt a quiet sense of peace. They had fought for the truth, for justice, and for the lives that depended on them. And in the end, that was what mattered most.